Today I'm addressing an ongoing issue with getting the scope sighted in on the Remington 700 with the new barrel. So at 100 yards I ran out of windage. So I'm putting rounds through a 1/4 inch hole 6 inches to the right of the bullseye at 100 yards. So I definitely have an issue with scope mounting. So the machine work's been done. I know that the action is straight. I know the barrel is straight. Everything is torqued correctly. So it's a scope issue. So taking everything apart, the first issue I noticed is that I'm still touching the front of my scope base, my loopholed 20 MOA scope base. I was still touching the front of the chassis here. So whether this happened during the first few firings and the gun is just settling in the chassis, I already checked all the chassis. There's only 2 bolts holding it into the chassis, so I already checked those. Those are still torqued correctly, so it's possible it moved a little bit and settled. So the first thing I did is I took some more material off the front of this and I did a quick just little cleanup on that. So I want to make sure I got a couple of thousandths of an inch of room. I don't want this base touching this recoil lug section. The recoil lug is actually right there. You're looking right at it, right where my finger is. So I don't want it touching the chassis. That's the first thing. Then I'm going to do a much better job of lapping those scope rings once I get them mounted, remounted again. You could see I did a quick job lapping them. I know I have the right tools. That's the Wheeler lapping kit, scope mounting kit. So I'm not going to do a video on lapping. I've done some before. You could just watch the video that's online from Wheeler about lapping those rings. It's real easy to do. You've got the lapping tool, you could see, which I've used some already. You've got your big fat torque wrench. Of course, final torque settings are also important. So before I took this apart, I re-zeroed the turrets on my scope. And I did this not at the range. I just took it outside. I aimed it up against a tree about 50, 60 yards away so I could get a good glimpse of where the crosshairs are moving. And I just recentered the scope up and down so that now it's back to absolute zero. Then I took the laser bore sighter, and so at about 30 yards away, I am still way off. So I'm going to set this up, do a completely fresh scope install, relap those rings, and then see where I'm at and go from there. It's very possible that it's just a bad installation. It's possible that I did something wrong. And it's also possible that my scope rings might be off, which means I might have to go with different rings. I might have to try a different configuration, maybe flip them front to back, left to right, up and down, whatever. So we'll see what happens then, and I will continue along. Alright, so our base is mounted, hand tight. You could see there's plenty of room in the front, so I don't have that issue. We've got our fat wrench set to about 15 inch-pounds. That's exactly what Loophole says, 15 to 17. And that's it. I got a little blue Loctite on the screws. Don't use red Loctite on the screws. You'll never get them apart. Perfect. And that's it for the scope base. So let's move on to mounting the rings and doing the lapping. Okay, so we've got the 2 indicators set up, and you can see that they're a little off. I'm trying to get the camera in there correctly. They're a little off, up, down, left, right. The only way to correct that is just to bend them. That's really all you can do. And just make sure that they're straight. So like, give them a little tweak. Left to right, and you want to point it at each other, and they have to be pointed at each other at every axis. And that's about as good as we're going to get. And that's about as technical as it is pointing these rings. The Picatinny rail that it's mounted to is not very forgiving. These things are basically machined, and then if they're on, they're on. And if they're off, you got to change them and try another one. So you could see, trying to get a little white background, that they're not perfect, but that's as good as I can get them for what I'm doing. And now we'll move on to lapping. So just a quick look inside the rings before that's the back one, the front one, and you want to get most of the black paint. Can't really do the top of the front one. You gotta want to get most of that black paint off. You want to see a lot of silver in there, and that tells you that you've lapped them correctly and that they're straight and that they're not going to leave marks on the scope. And you see the black finish on the scope. I have a little bit of abrasion on the rear, which I don't like. That tells me that the scope was definitely moving. Not so much on the front, yeah, a little bit on the bottom. You could see that. So this scope was definitely moving in those rings during the course of its use, but we're going to try to do everything we can to stop that. And that's the whole point of lapping, by the way. The more surface area that's touching the scope is all that more surface area to counteract the friction and the inertia of the gun firing in that recoil. So you want to get more contact. More is better. Alright, so this took about 15 minutes. Just using the tool, back and forth, putting a little on, back and forth, retorquing the screws. And you're only putting the screws hand tight, because if you put them any more than hand tight, you can't move this, moves back and forth to polish up and remove material from the rings. And you don't want to remove too much. If you remove too much, then you'll end up not being able to torque the caps down. So the caps I've marked, I don't know if I can see it in here, I've marked with a little tiny F so that they face forward. So that's the way the cap is going to go on there. And as we flip the cap over, you can see how much material it's removed. And you want to try to get it as even as possible. So this cap, I removed a little bit more material towards the back, but it's a lot better than what it was. Same thing with the front one. So that's got an F on it right there, so that would sit this way. So if we flip it over, that's where the material comes off from. Okay, so that's the base. These are the caps. Much better than it was before. I'm going to use a little degreaser, clean them up, mount the scope in there, and torque everything down, and we'll go on from there. So I mounted the scope, and I have the same issue. It's off to the right, which means the scope has to move to the right. Windage adjustment to the left. So what I did was I made up these little strips of aluminum foil, and I used aluminum foil because it's easy to work with, and it compresses, but it doesn't compress after a certain amount. It'll stop compressing. It's a metal. So I compressed it and I folded it up and I put it underneath the front ring on the side of the Picatinny rail. So that moved the scope to the right, which is what I need. If you needed to move it to the left, you'd put the spacer under the back one, and that would move the scope the other way. So to pivot left to right on the rail, and I fixed the problem. So if I can get the camera, and you can see the laser actually ended up overcorrecting a little bit, which is fine. That little bit I can make up with the windage adjustment. Because don't forget, I reset this to 0 before I started this whole thing. So that's fine. And I'm not concerned about the elevation. As long as the windage is okay. I had plenty of elevation. I only have, on this scope, 4 turns lock to lock, left to right on the windage, while I've got 11 turns lock to lock on the elevation. So plenty of elevation, not too much windage. And she's done. So next stop will be at the range.